I'm Tom Sokorichka.
And I'm Michael Krawick.
From NottsPod, this is Trentbelly.
Episode 12, The Water Cycle. We've done it, Tom. We made a podcast series.
We did the thing.
Yeah, your dream has come true.
Feels good.
It is now the final episode of Trentbelly. We've reached the end of our journey through the history of the Trent and the water industry, going from having 300 wells in the city of Nottingham to Severn Trent, the private company running things. When we started, we were looking at sewage pollution. Then we realised it's not just sewage pollution. Then we spoke to Scott, who in our recorded and unrecorded conversations made us very aware of how little we knew yet.
Yeah.
And he also opened our eyes to how unnatural our rivers are, and that led us to learn about all the other ways besides polluting rivers that we have as a species messed around with the rivers.
It's terrifying and fascinating. I was particularly excited to learn through this series of Nottingham's contribution to the development of the water industry as well, specifically Thomas Hawksley.
Local legend Thomas Hawksley. When we look back over the history of the water industry in our rivers, it's helped us making this podcast to have these sort of named figures who've sort of guided us through the different stages of this journey. That's helped us to humanize the process, because ultimately it is just people doing things with water and infrastructure and rivers. We talk about corporations and sanitary committees.
Another good commission as well.
And
Royal Commission, sorry.
Regional authorities,
Yeah.
royal commissions.
Yeah.
All of those things are just ways that people organize themselves into groups and call themselves things. The corporations exist in our imaginations. There's not something that you can point to as the corporation. It's people who are agreeing that they are part of a corporation. In reforming the water industry, like reforming anything, it's just about trying to reorganize people, incentivize people, get them doing the good work that needs to be done with the resources that need to be done. That's the basic thing underneath all this. All the complicated stuff is just about how we get those things done. When we look at the characters who we've encountered on our journey through history, we have Hawksley, who was big on the private companies and saw the councils as corrupt relics of the past and didn't trust them to run things. Tarbotton, who comes of age when the local authorities are getting reformed and they're really cool, and he's seen the failure of the private companies. We then have Beddoe, who post-World War II is part of the nationalisation trend. He's seen that nationalising things can work, and he's seen the failure of the local municipal model. And then you have Thatcher, who sees the failures in the nationalised industries, and she thinks there's a lot of good to be had in the private sector rather than the state. And all these people, shaped by their experiences, correctly identified flaws in the systems they had lived through and came up with solutions, and were not always capable of spotting the flaws in their alternative proposals. The Victorians who took over the private water companies didn't realise that there would be other things beyond the profit motive that might cause investment starvation. Approaching this from having only known the privatised model, we did go into this expecting to come down firmly in favour of just nationalise the whole thing.
Yeah, there's poo in the water. Severn Trent put it there. Severn Trent bad. Need to stop. That's kind of what I thought. That's why this originally was only going to be 1 or 2 episodes. But it quickly became clear that it was just way more nuanced than that. Our lived experience has been one of a privatised water industry. And because of that, that's going to shape our views as to what we think its failings are and where we want to go with it next. If, as we have grown up with this privatised model, and we've seen it fail, quite naturally the instinct is, well, the solution must be the opposite to the privatised model, some form of nationalisation. if we recognize the biases that come with drawing exclusively upon our lived experience, we can just get trapped in this seesaw of private, national, private, national, private, national, and not actually break free of that and create a sustainable model which builds upon and corrects the mistakes of both of them.
When we came to learn about privatization and actually grapple with the arguments that were being made at the time, that was quite challenging for us because our starting point being it's obviously failed. I think we've come away with a better understanding of why we disagree with it now. We are not just disagreeing with a cartoon caricature of Margaret Thatcher and Nicholas Ridley, who were like, yes, soon our allies will be able to profit off the water. We're disagreeing with the real arguments for it rather than pretend arguments.
I can understand why that view had appeal in those circles within the context of that time. And like any one of these people that has pioneered a new vision for water, their primary objective is to solve the problems of what existed before. And it's kind of impossible to envisage all of the problems that might come from the new model that you're proposing, because that's the point. It's a new model and we want to see how it works.
So in order to solve this, we need to expand our capacity to imagine a better ways of doing things, basically. That's the starting point.
We've looked at what the government's got to say about what this bright new future looks like, and we're not impressed. Indeed, we talked about in previous episodes how the scope of the review into the water industry was artificially restricted. We want to transform the industry in a revolutionary way within the context of the existing model that we have right now. And it's intensely frustrating.
Going on this journey, I do feel like I have become radicalized, but in a different way to what I expected, because the popular radical position is to smash the nationalization button. Arguably, it's more radical, therefore, to go beyond privatization and nationalization, which is how we now feel about it. We do recognize that the privatized model has failed, but I also don't think we should wholesale nationalize the water industry. When a water company fails, it should have the threat of an alternative ownership structure over it, whether that is nationalization, mutualization, becoming a charitable trust, becoming a private non-profit company. What we want is for there to be a serious threat to the private companies that fail for their ownership to change. We're not advocating a specific form of ownership. We think that ultimately the people who live in the regions that these companies cover, the water basins, they should be the ones that decide how their water is organized, how it is run. It may well be that if a private company does a good job, fine. The private company can keep existing if it proves it's good enough to keep existing. We have the examples of the Victorian water-only companies that survive to the present day because their local authorities chose not to take over them because people were generally happy with them. And that could happen with our giant regional water companies. We stop ourselves thinking that way when we group them all together.
Yeah.
And when there's no threat of an alternative to them. We talked in the privatization episode about how the model didn't really allow for competition. You know, there's a bit of they'll compete on reputation or share price or for how well they can borrow. If we have the scope for a failed water company to go into a different model chosen by the local people, then the private companies have to compete with alternate ownership models within the country. And they'll face an existential threat to their existence and therefore have to prove their existence as private companies to keep going. And that's potentially an element of competition which could work.
If you believe in the private model, the capitalist model, then by a logical extension, you believe in competition as a means by which to provide the best service. And if you're going to have this model, then having that option makes obvious sense. if these companies can only make money for their shareholders by removing all competition, then that's a fundamentally broken system.
And even the Victorians recognised that the water companies eventually stopped competing.
Yeah.
So we need something other than private companies to provide that competition. Like, if you believe that they will run it best, let them prove it against the alternatives. Having the explicit threat of them no longer being private companies is not an issue if they do well enough that we never have to impose that.
You know what though? Let me just take the opposite view and put this to you. Right. So these private companies, they need to raise private capital to fund the maintenance and investment spending. If you're an investor, you've got so many options to choose from when it comes to where you want to put your money. And obviously, you want to put your money where you're going to get the greatest return. So if I'm an investor, I'm thinking, right, well, there's been all this change to the water companies now. I'm worried that if I put my money in water as opposed to anything else in the world, all this additional regulation, all this threat of nationalization, this creates uncertainty in this industry now. Maybe it creates lower returns. Why should I invest in this? I'll pull my money elsewhere. And then what you find is the water industry is unable to raise the money that it needs to sustain itself.
I guess my counter would be investment is meant to involve risk, and there is not meant to be a guaranteed return because you are investing in something which does have the capacity to not pay out in future. However much you control for it as much as possible, you can't have the government artificially confirming that a company will always succeed. That's a giant moral hazard.
No, I take what you said, because I think about Thames Water. You've got these investors, and they must be saying, we're literally putting poo in the rivers and not delivering. Like, we've got 40% leakage rate, and we're still making loads of money for the shareholders. This is amazing. But of course, like, that's a problem. Like,
that's not a good thing.
Okay.
And I bought a share of Severn Trent. And when I had to set up this app, or when you get the adverts for these apps, there's all the small print disclaimers, which are like, your capital is at risk, investments can go down as well as up, past performance is not a guarantee of future returns. And like, if I have to agree to all that and acknowledge that to buy one share of Severn Trent on an app, a professional investor should also be aware of these things and be able to take them into account.
You know what, mate? You just said that, but I want you to check the share price. And if it's exploded in value, watch you do a 180 turn on the virtues of the private system and how shareholder involvement in this private sector is amazing and the future of the industry.
So it's gone up by 9.25%.
Really? That's really good. Yeah. That's way more than I thought.
Yeah. I bought it for 2,962 pence.
Yep.
And it is now worth 3,236 pence. So actually, it turns out privatized water is great. Yeah, the share that we bought for this has done pretty well in the 2 weeks. All caveats about capital at risk. This is not financial advice, all that stuff. We're not advocating everyone goes out and buys shares in anything at all. And I can see how, having experienced the joy of looking at my one share and seeing it gone up in value, I can see how a shareholder is going to be reluctant to shift away from the privatized model. Hey, it's Michael from slightly in the future compared to when we first recorded this episode. Little update on the share price. Since we recorded, between then and now, the share price of Severn Trent has actually dropped, and it is now worth 2,850 pence, which is a drop of 3.78% compared to the purchase price. Investments can go down as well as up, as they say.
Yeah.
Back to the episode. Looking back over the historical arc, there were a few recurrent threads. A big one that might be hard for us to accept at the moment, where our current model is failing and we just want something to be done about it to fix it, is that it took ages for the Victorians to deal with their sewage crisis decades before the local authorities had the full powers they needed to sort that out. And then the municipal system existed for decades, despite all its failures, with just occasional tweaks here and there to try and encourage them to sort out the problem.
Yeah, so we sort of zip through time quite quickly. And you can think that, oh, and then the Victorians just changed this, and then the local government just did this. But it took ages for these things to happen. We've condensed it down. But the Victorian water reform that ended the cholera outbreaks, which were obviously killing loads of people, that took 17 years for them to get a grip on that. Sometimes the way we talk about it was this, then this, then this. But these are very long processes which occurred only once we'd reached these crisis points.
You know, we talked in the last episode about how the government's current plan is a bit disappointing, but perhaps we are still in the middle of this phase of the water industry where the government is trying to tweak things to see if it'll still work.
Governments have this bias towards just kicking the can down the road. We're in government for 5 years, but to be honest, think about how quickly you've been cycling through prime ministers. A prime minister's probably thinking, I'm not even going to probably be in power for 5 years. If you're a water minister, you've got a year and a bit. You don't have any incentive on a strictly personal level anyway to think, right, let's sort this out properly once and for all. It took the Victorians 17 years to sort out the sewerage infrastructure to stop the cholera epidemics. We're going to need change and a vision on that kind of time scale as well. And when you're cycling through ministers and prime ministers like nobody's business, we don't really have the political system that's set up to actually solve these problems beyond just fixing sticking plaster after sticking plaster after sticking plaster. And water supply and sewage has also historically been a Cinderella service. I really like that word. I keep coming back to it. But even if you go back to the times when we had open sewers running down Listergate, even though it must have stank, even though it must have been awful, people were very reluctant to transition away from that because they knew they would be taxed for it. They didn't want to pay for it. For the citizens around at the time, this wasn't a high priority. And what we can see, the common thread is that throughout history, voters and councils have had water and sewage quite low down on their list of priorities. I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong. I'm just saying it's often low down. And that means that the service gets neglected, it gets underfunded, and then that's how the crisis builds. An additional challenge as well is the recognition that pollution in rivers doesn't just come from sewage. In some ways, though we've identified there are enormous difficulties in trying to reform this sector, it's other factors such as agricultural pollution which pose thornier problems. With water companies, there's only a handful of those. There's thousands of farms. How are you going to involve them? They all have their unique geography, ownership structures as well, and there's just way more of them. How do you manage that? If you want clean rivers, that's something you have to consider. Agricultural pollution is just as significant, if not more significant in some areas, than sewage pollution, as is urban runoff as well. Rubber from tires, leaking oil from vehicles and cars, also a significant factor, and we need solutions to those. Going back to the imagination point, we need to just completely rethink about how we integrate all of these things together. And it involves this fundamental paradigm shift as to how we approach these problems. A good example of this is, in some ways, we're still relying on Victorian-style solutions to solving these problems, broadly based around hard engineering, building physical infrastructure. We've talked about how water companies don't really like replacing pipes because it doesn't add any value to the company. If we take that one step further, investment in things like wetland restoration and expanding floodplains also have a problem with being quantified in such a way that it adds to the portfolio of the private companies, right? If you're a private company and you're an investor, you want something that you can put a number on that can justify a share price. But how do you do that with something like restoring a wetland to prevent flooding or to catch water that would otherwise run off a farm into the river? It's way easier to just say, let's just build a thing and then we can put a number on how much that costs. And then that can determine like the value of this company. But we need to go beyond that. And the private model struggles with that. It struggles with that certainly by itself. A lot of the solutions to these problems, whether it's sewage, agricultural pollution, or urban runoff, are going to involve these more holistic environmental solutions, or what's called like pre-pipe solutions. So trying to stop these pollutants even getting into the sewage system to begin with before it works its way through to the sewage treatment plants or through the combined overflows into the rivers. And that will also involve an expansion of our imagination.
As well as imagining better ways of running things, we also need to imagine better rivers. We need to remember that the Trent used to be smug, silver, crystal, and imagine that it could be like that again. We don't need to be resigned to Britain's rivers dying because of sewage and agricultural pollution and weirs all over the place blocking fishes.
Scott talked about this idea of a kind of like baseline adjustment syndrome where we just look at the River Trent and it's brown and we can't really see much going on in it and we just think that's the baseline, that's the normal. That's our lived experience. But yeah, we need to go beyond that, don't we? And we can consult the historical poetry that existed at the time to sort of help us reimagine that.
One of the last books I read for this series was Robert Macfarlane's Is a River Alive, which is kind of like him going on a holiday visiting various rivers and reflecting about them. But it introduced me to the Rights of Nature movement, which advocates that nature and natural things should have legal rights. So a river could have legal rights that protect it in law in much the same way that, say, a corporation, which is this imaginary entity that we create for legal reasons, is legally treated as a person in many ways and has rights. So it's not actually that much different to what we already do with an imaginary corporate entity to instead give a very real, physical, natural thing legal rights. Although it is radical, it's not actually that much of a step from what we already do. This way of relating to nature and rivers is something that we have kind of lost in Britain. It goes back to treating the river as a person, like our old poems did at the start, where we used to think of the rivers as an entity that you'd have like imaginary conversations with. You'd imagine it having a personality as it floods or gives its fish around. The Rights of Nature movement is a way to sort of reconnect with that way of thinking and incorporate the wisdom from that perspective into law in order to protect our natural landscapes. That is something that we could do in Britain. Another problem that we touched on with the rivers that we need to imagine better is weirs, fish passes. In order to get the Trent to be at a state where it can offer up its fish to us again, the fish need to travel up and down the river. We've seen how that's been done with the River Severn and with the rivers in Yorkshire, with the Great Yorkshire River Partnership. We could do a similar thing with the Trent. It just needs the sort of funding and partnership working to address that. Who's the new CEO of Severn Trent again?
James Jessic.
James Jessic. If you're listening, you have the chance to do something really cool. Organise a partnership across the Trent to install fish passes and remove redundant weirs. You've got the wildlife trusts, you've got the Trent Rivers Trust, you've got loads of enthusiastic volunteers who'll help out with this. It will also be a big reputational boost for Severn Trent. This could be something that gets celebrated widely, and in 100 years' time, there might be a hologram podcast about the history of the rivers, and your name might be mentioned as someone who led the way on restoring the Trent, in contrast to like the CEOs of other private water companies, which are remembered as corporate vampires who extracted wealth and destroyed the planet.
No, I was surprised to find actually that compared to the other water companies, that Severn Trent at least by the measurements and guidance provided by the Environment Agency, which may be flawed. They are one of, if not the best water company that there is. There's a sort of national narrative, water company is bad. I thought, therefore, Severn Trent must be bad. But it's way more complicated than that. And what we've explored over some of the past episodes, particularly the recent ones, is we've just painted all the water companies with the same brush.
But also the water companies have done that themselves by having the shared lobby group. So they have tarred themselves with the same brush by unifying behind one lobbying group.
Something that kind of emerged, particularly when you're reading about big water spills and fines and people having to have water delivered to their homes. This is all happening in the south of England. Most of these scandals, most of the big spills, most of the pollution events, most of the financial and economic mismanagement is happening by the water companies down in the south of England. And it's got a lot of national attention as a result. I can't help but feel when you have a media that's based in London and the south of England, that there is a bias towards that, and problems that are happening in the south of England are taken more seriously than they are elsewhere.
We made this podcast in part because of the decline of local media and the fact that local issues, which may be national issues, were not covered from the perspective of Nottingham in the Midlands. And looking at the water industry has kind of highlighted the importance of having those local perspectives around the country, so that we are not just assuming that an issue that is affecting the south is the same everywhere, because it isn't. Like, you know, we're not a massive country, but there are plenty of regional variations across the country.
When you're listening to a podcast or watching the news or consuming any kind of media, what's become clear to us making this is it will have this London southern bias to it. And that can actually give you a very misleading impression when you take that story and apply it to here. It may not actually match or be congruent with the situation in Nottingham, in the East Midlands. And I can see why people in like Scotland and Wales moan all the time about having an English-centric perspective, because it doesn't tell their story, which is so different. And within England, just as you described, we have this massive diversity as well of history, of industry, of culture, and we're just getting London voices all the time. And I don't want to like talk down London. I actually like going to visit there, and I've got friends from London, some of whom may be watching this podcast, but that is a perspective which is overrepresented, and if you consume too much media from that source, it will leave you with a misleading impression of your local area.
We've made this as a Nottingham podcast, but we've covered a national story, and we've been very open about our local bias. But the London-based media doesn't highlight its local bias in London, because that's just the norm.
Yeah, I agree. Some of the episodes we've talked about doing sort of touch on the history and culture of Derbyshire, and we've discussed how we approach that, given the sort of vast chasm of cultural differences between this county and Derbyshire. And but I do think that's something you have to sort of be mindful of and take into account, because people are proud to be from their local area, which will have actually like quite a small geographical reach. That's something that's just completely missed when you consume nationally produced content. So all of this can sound a little bit scary, can't it? This is way, way bigger than we could have anticipated. And you can see why when you examine how multifaceted this issue is, how the problems are polycausal, that it begs the question, where can we start to sort it out? And I would say you've already done the first thing by listening to this podcast. So that's step one.
We do feel a bit like we've done a public service here in putting a potted history of the water industry together that in a way that's accessible. So if you have found this podcast valuable, feel free to share it around. A big thing that is needed to solve this problem is for people to care about it. And if you think this podcast will help people achieve that, then share it around.
It's a very teachery thing to say, but it really does begin with education. And once you have the education and the knowledge, you will then feel, as we do, this internal motivation to try and do something about it. And that doesn't necessarily mean you've got to be standing next to Trent every day with placards drawing attention to this issue. It can just be having a conversation like with a mate about it. The more important this becomes in the public imagination, the more impetus there will be for a government, local or national, to take this more seriously.
We mentioned in a previous episode that there used to be no votes in sewage. Don't let that be the case again. Have this issue be something that impacts your political choices, whether that be your voting choices. If you're active in political parties, contact your MP, work with your local parties to get solutions to this problem put into their manifestos and their policies. If you have spare time or money, you can donate those to the Trent Rivers Trust or the wildlife trusts in your local area, or there's the Canal and Rivers Trust, which also you can volunteer with them or donate to them, and they do rewilding schemes as well along the navigable parts of the river. So there's plenty of rewilding schemes, plenty of citizen science volunteering opportunities to work with, or if you don't have the time, just a few quid will help towards that. And you will have done a bit towards improving the river for the future. And if we get a smug and silver Trent again, you can say that you did a little bit towards that. Ultimately, any positive contribution, any positive constructive action is better than just ranting about it at home. If you help to educate someone else about it, you donate a bit of money, donate a bit of time, that will have more of an impact than just moaning about it. We can have a better river and a better water industry. We just have to be able to imagine it and put a bit of effort into making it come into being. Thank you so much for listening. At time of recording, we have no idea if you're one of our 3 listeners.
Yeah.
Or we have more than that. We're recording this before any episode is releasing.
We spoke to a number of people making this podcast, and we want to give a particular thanks to the people at the Canal and Rivers Trust.
At the University of Nottingham, we'd like to thank all of the staff at Manuscripts and Special Collections for all their help, and David Beckingham and Rachel Dishington, who put on an exhibition about the River Leen.
We'd also like to thank the Trent Rivers Trust, in particular Vanessa Sumpman, who picked up the phone to me after my random email saying, we're making a podcast about the River Trent. She could tell that I was completely out of my depth with my very basic line of questioning, and she very patiently answered those and put us in contact with Dr. Scott Mackenzie as well, who also took the time to come down and be our first guest. And I'm so grateful that he was able to assist us.
I'd also like to thank Bromley House Library and all the staff there.
That was particularly important because there was so much information that came out of that library that is just not available online. And that is why we were able to make this podcast with information and tie things together, which you otherwise wouldn't be able to do just using the internet. We'd also like to thank the staff and volunteers at Papplewick Pumping Station. Particular shout out to Colin as well, who was our tour guide at Papplewick Pumping Station. Really sort of galvanised our interest in that particular aspect of our story.
For help with certain aspects of the research, I'd like to thank Nabil Fadai and Jonathan Thornton. I would like to thank the Dream Team, they know who they are, for the bottle of champagne that we're drinking now. The NottsPod logo was made by Michael Wade and Darren Krellin. If you're watching the video version, the paintings behind us were made by Rebecca Ellis. The theme music for Trentbelly was Crystalline by Keencast Morera. Trentbelly was a NottsPod series, presented and produced by me, Michael Krawick.
And me, Tom Sokorechka.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.